And
There you go. I see your screen.
Okay, so I'm Judith, Bas Rabbi Mendel. I've been in the SCA since 10, 15 years, 20 years, something like that. But when I first started, I had already been keeping kosher for a long time, since 1980. And a quick question came up of how would you do it back then? I couldn't assume that what I knew about keeping kosher modernly was going to be what applied today. And so, as with many people in the SCA, I decided to volunteer to teach a class in medieval Jewish cooking. I'd been doing historical research on Jewish foods for just off and on since the 1980s, but hadn't ever just focused on the Middle Ages. So I was 6 months out, jumping in with both feet. And my husband rashly made the same decision to do it in Arabic cooking. So we went on a day-long date off to the Culinary Institute of America, ransacked their library at length, and that's how we started the process. I knew I was going to learn how people kept kosher back in the Middle Ages sideways. Nobody was going to have written about it at length. I was going to find out about it as I did other studies. But having taught that class successfully, the topic is way too big. So I narrowed it down to Passover. And that's what I've been studying since the early 2005 or something like that, last 15 or so years. And generally I did it by taking one of the Passover foods a year and doing 9 months of research on what did the rabbis say, what were the practices, and then spending 3 months in the kitchen trying to figure out how to make it. And I've now gotten through all the foods, and sometime soon I need to work on putting it all together in a printable form and putting it out there. But that's where this research comes from. I usually start by asking people. Right now I can see one of you, and all the rest of you are just, it would be fine for me to see you because I need to know the answers to a few questions. I need to know your own, what you know, so I know how much background I have to give. Do all of you know what Passover is? Do I need to explain that to anybody?
I don't think necessarily you need to.
Okay. Do I need to explain what a Seder is?
I think everybody should know. If they don't, they'll pop up.
Okay.
So,
The Haggadah, which is the ceremony for the Seder. Okay.
I think most of us are Jews that are on this thing. Probably we all probably know this, but
okay. The Torah. Okay, generally the first 5 books of Moses in the Bible. Okay.
Yeah, I think we're good.
The Mishnah, written around 200.
Would you mind talking about that one? That one I do not know.
Okay. The tradition is that there is a oral tradition and a written tradition to the Torah. And the written one is most of it's what you've got in the Bible. But the oral tradition was sort of like the how-tos. So if in the Bible, it tells you do a sacrifice. Well, how do you do that sacrifice? What hand do you hold the grain in? How deeply do you dip your fingers? What do you do with it when you take it out? It is really the how-tos and discussion of how to for much of what is in the Bible as the law. And it was an oral tradition passed down from one rabbi to another. And my English copy of it is this fat. I mean, it is a feat of memory that people learned it and could pass it on. Okay. And with the destruction of the temple in 70, the concern became that it was going to be lost because a lot of it had to do with temple worship, and you weren't going to see it practiced and have a way to remember it that way. So finally it was written down. It's sort of, oddly enough, it's considered to be sort of a companion print dating to the New Testament of the Christians. Okay? They were both being established about the same period. But the rabbis who put that together and discussed it at length didn't quit their discussions, they continued them. And you get those discussions then codified in the Talmud. Okay, the Talmud is built on the Mishnah, and there are actually two Talmuds. There's the Jerusalem Talmud, which dates from around 400, and the more authoritative one, which is the Babylonian Talmud, which was finished, the dates are somewhat iffy, 500 say some, 700 say others, somewhere in that period. But of course, rabbis don't stop discussing things. They continue, they debate, and the debate became, how do we put everything together in a reasonable way to study it and understand it that takes out all the parts that we're not doing anymore? Let's just focus on daily life and how do we live it today. And there were several attempts at doing it that were not successful. But in 565, you have the publication of something called the Shulchan Aruch, the set table, by a rabbi named Caro. He was looking at some of the major writings of rabbis in the Middle Ages and trying to come up with decisions about what was the right way to do something. And he tended to favor the Sephardic method practices. Those are the ones in back up. The Ashkenazi period, the region, is Northern and Eastern Europe. And the rest of Europe, which was Spain and Portugal and parts of southern France and parts of Italy, is considered the Sephardic area. And that was one of the problems with those codes, that it would be for one region and not for another. And another rabbi named Iserles took Caro's writings and wrote what was called the tablecloth for it. Okay? And he added the Ashkenazi practices into it. And it almost reads like a conversation between the two. Well, this is what we do here. This is why we do it. And back and forth, segment by segment between the two rabbis. And that today, that Shulchan Aruch, dating from the late 1500s, is authoritative for practices of Jews today. There hasn't been anything that has come anywhere close to being a more modern interpretation of things. For our purposes, it makes it very neat. It means I can look at the Talmud and say, well, that's pretty much early medieval stuff. And then look at the Shulchan Aruch as being the end of the period. So, and look at the changes that happened in that time. So you'll see me bouncing between, this is what this one says, this is what the other one says, because they so nicely bookend everything. Any questions about that so far? I have a handout. It was supposed to be made available to you guys. Can that get put in chat or something like that? The very end of it actually has a glossary with all these things that if you suddenly get lost and go, what? I don't remember what that is again. You can look it up for yourself and sort of get yourself back on track that way.
And do you have yeah, if you could put the handout into the chat, that'd be great. If not, did you already upload it to the?
I sent it a few days ago.
Oh, probably to Talina probably has it.
Yeah.
It'll be uploaded. It'll eventually get uploaded into the West, so it'll be shared later. So yeah, sorry about that.
You'll also find in there a whole lot of recipes, because I keep being asked to give people recipes to make things, and it's all there. So when I teach this class, normally it's in person, and then I've made a lot of the stuff and I pass it out. So you're having to virtually, obviously, I can't do that. So, but the recipes for what I make and do for the taste testing, no, if you ever get to Penzik, I teach this class there regularly. There's some famous rabbis. I've mentioned two. One was Joseph Caro and another Moses Iserles, who were together did the Shulchan Aruch. There's a famous French rabbi named Shlomo Yitzhaki. It's a tough name to say, it's long. People are lazy, the Jewish practice is to give them nicknames. So he's known as Rashi. There's a famous, or not famous, pretty well known at this point, modern series of books on Rashi's daughters. He's an interesting guy to study because his daughters really were well educated. We know they prayed with tefillin. We know they were, their children became famous rabbis in their own right. So those were interesting women to watch in the Middle Ages. Another famous rabbi is Moses Maimonides. That's, again, too long to say. His Jewish name is Moshe ben Maimon. Again, long and awkward, so it's shortened to Rambam. Okay. And for purposes of Passover, there's another famous rabbi named Amram. He was a leader or a president of an academy in Babylonia, and is the first person who wrote down the entire Passover ceremony that we have. He was asked by the synagogue in Barcelona. Jews tend to travel. So Barcelona, way off in the ends of the known world, would have other people come visit and say, you're doing everything wrong. That isn't how we do it in Paris. That isn't how we do it in Mainz. You've got it wrong. And these poor folks in Barcelona said, well, maybe we are doing it wrong. And they wrote to Amram and they said, please help us out. Send us something that will know how to do things right. So he sent them a year worth of prayers with explanations of how to do it right, and explanations of this is where local traditions can are fine. These are the things where you have to be firm on these points. So his Haggadah is what every Haggadah today is based on. It caught on like wildfire across the whole known Jewish world. And it was copied and copied and copied, and it's really hard to figure out what the original was. We've got 4 versions that are several hundred years after the time of Amram. And it's tough, but that's all we've got to work with is those later copies. I've worked at some on translating it. I'd like to finish the project, but I have to find somebody else who can read Rashi script to help me out with the last bits of it. I think that's it for the introduction. So now I'll start in on the going through. The foods that were eaten for the Seder, they include a green vegetable dipped in a liquid called charosis, bitter herbs called maror, charosis, a mixture of fruit and nuts ground to resemble mortar, matzah, the unleavened bread, wine, 4 cups for the ceremony, plus extra that's drunk with a meal, meat, or a main meal, a roasted egg, and some sort of sweets. If you went to a Seder in the Middle Ages, the ceremony would be very familiar, but we would find the food strikingly different. The matzah would be as thick as your finger. The bitter herbs would be lettuce. Horseradish might be an ingredient in the charosis, and the foods would be dipped in watery charosis, and you might eat lamb as the main course. Okay. After the destruction of the temple, the Seder had to change. We don't know much about what the ceremony would have been like before then. We have no records of the details about how it was kept for nearly 2,000 years. Some descriptions can be found in the Mishnah, but it's not enough to really build on. After the destruction of the temple, no longer was the focus on the sacrifice and the roasting and the eating of the lamb, and instead the emphasis changed to being on the matzah. It became like secular Greco-Roman feasts, starting with an array of hors d'oeuvres. The Babylonian Talmud stipulates that each person should have before them the matzah, maror, and charosis. And the next course was roasted and boiled meat, poultry, or some delicacies. And the last course was fruit or sweets. But that's about all we've got as a description. At this point, I'm going to go through each of the ingredients on the Seder plate and talk about them. And as I finish each one, I'll take a pause, and if anybody has questions, that would be a good time to ask. The green vegetable, the charosis. Well, first question is, what green vegetable? And the preference was originally for bitter lettuce. The problem is that it was going to be used later in the meal for the bitter herbs, and you don't want to say a blessing twice over the same food. A 4th century sage recommended replacing the lettuce with some other vegetable. And the Jerusalem Talmud said one custom was to use 2 vegetables, and that if the charosis vegetable should not be bitter. And what to do if they couldn't find any, if availability was an issue. Amram held that it was permissible to use the same food twice if that's all that was available. And in this, he's following the guidance of the Talmud. Amram gives a list of acceptable vegetables: celery, radishes, lettuce, arugula, cilantro, and parsley. And he's the first place we find celery in that list. The preference ended up being based on what people believed about the different vegetables and about its effects. Radishes were thought to be good with fever and aided digestion. Lettuce, well, dreaming about it meant your business might either grow rapidly or it might decline. So that seemed a little risky. Cilantro meant your children would be stout, but parsley meant you'd have beautiful children. No surprise, we use parsley most. The term carpus actually means celery or parsley in Persian, Aramaic, and Arabic. The two plants are closely related and often confused in the ancient world. The use of the term to describe this part of the ritual dates from the 13th century in France. As I said, this green vegetable was supposed to be dipped, and then the question comes up of dipped in what? Lettuce dipped in sauce was a common hors d'oeuvre at Roman meals. The Mishnah describes dipping lettuce in vinegar before breaking bread. In the early Middle Ages, the practice was to dip the lettuce in watery charosis. Everything before the Seder meal itself, all the foods eaten in the first half of the ceremony, were dipped in that watery charosis. Rashi, Rambam, and other French rabbis in the 12th century argued that charoset should not be used for dipping because it was going to be used later in the meal. To keep with tradition, they decided that some other liquid should be used, and Rashi and Rambam chose vinegar for their own use.
Judith, there's a question about, was the carpus cooked or raw?
Raw.
Thank you.
Never cooked. Yeah. Good question. The Shulchan Aruch agreed that the charoset should not be eaten until it's used with the bitter herb, and ruled that wine vinegar or salt water should be used. And in later times, salt water came to be preferred. And I've hunted, I cannot find, my past hunts, when salt water came into being as the preferred use, which it is today. Now people talk about it as, to remind us of the tears, but in the Middle Ages, it was clearly vinegar they were using instead. If it wasn't after they stopped using the watery charoset. Any other questions about the green vegetable? Okay. Okay, charoset is a mixture of fruit and veg and nuts mixed in a liquid and ground to make a paste. It's supposed to resemble the clay or mortar that's used with bricks in Egypt. The Greeks and Romans had similar dishes. The handout has about 5 or 6 different recipes because different rabbis said, oh, this is mine and this is mine. My favorite is one rabbi who, it's his mother's recipe. He doesn't say, oh, this is what I make. He's honest about it. It's his mother who's in the kitchen making. In the Mishnah, the rabbis disagreed about whether it was a religious obligation to eat the charoset. It's not mentioned in the Bible or any Jewish sources before 70, unlike other Seder foods. The Babylonian Talmud said its purpose was to blunt the bitter flavor and poisonous elements of the maror. The recipes for it vary greatly. When we were starting, I said I'd done some research on the history of different Jewish foods. And soon after I started keeping kosher, I discovered that there were all these different recipes for charosis. Really, it depended on where you were located and what was available at that time of year. Obviously, in Eastern Europe, there wasn't much left in the root cellar at the end of the winter, and you had maybe a pear or two, a couple apples, and you used them along with some nuts, and that's what your charosis was made of. But in other parts of the world, they were really going crazy with the fruit that they had available. So it very much depends on geography. The Jerusalem Talmud said the charosis should be thin and remind us of blood. The Babylonian Talmud says it should be thick and remind us of apples. They're referring to the apple trees where when the Jews were slaves in Egypt, the women joined their husbands, thwarting in secret, thwarting the Pharaoh's attempt to keep them apart and thus prevent the women from having children. The solution of the 12th century rabbis, of the descendants of the school of Rashi, are called the Tosafos, and a very large group of well-known rabbis who all debated Talmud and biblical issues. They were looking at these two Talmudic traditions. Should it be thin or should it be thick? And their solution was to serve thick charosis and then thin it out at the table with wine and vinegar. That, of course, raised the question whether or not on the Sabbath, if the Passover should fall then, is this considered cooking? Is this a problem? In the 15th century, one rabbi solved this by mixing the liquid differently, using his finger in a way that it could not be considered kneading or cooking, because he was doing the mixing so differently. The oldest recipe we have is from Saadia Gaon's prayer book. He's another president of a academy in Babylonia. He died in about 975 and lived after Amram. So the Saadia Gaon's recipe is in the handout. But what's interesting is it doesn't include the apples stipulated in the Talmud. Rashi's description of charosis is the earliest one that we have that calls for using wine as to mix in instead of wine vinegar. Rambam wrote down two recipes, they're in the handout. Eliezer ben Natan of Mainz, who lived from 1090 to 1170, thought charosis should be bitter and acidic because apples were sour. But both he and Rabbi Eliezer ben Judah of Worms in the 11th century included horseradish as ingredients in their recipes. Rabbi Eliezer ben Judah also put in black radish. I don't know if you've ever tried it. It's about maybe this big. And it's coal black until you cut into it, and the inside is white, white, white. It's very striking, but it's got a very radishy flavor to it. Rabbi Elijah of London, whose recipe you've also got, included spikenard as one of the ingredients. The Tosafos, in the school of Rashi, and Rabbi Elijah of London suggested that all the fruits mentioned in the biblical book Song of Songs should be used. And that became a common practice. That meant it would include apples and dates and figs and pomegranates and nuts. And again, that's a question of whether or not you can get your hand on pomegranates at that time of year. One practice was to add ginger and cinnamon diced to look like straw. Another practice dating from the 12th century was to add clay or grit from a brick in the recipe. One report of German practices in the 1500s says that charosis was shaped like a brick. In the 14th century, in Ashkenazi regions, some major rabbis forbade the use of dried fruit because of their concern that they were dried with flour. And we'll talk about this later, the changing rules about what fruits and foods could be used. Rabbi Luria's mother, her recipe called for sweet spikenard, ginger, cinnamon sticks, as well as 7 kinds of fruit. And in the 16th century, we have a Spanish rabbi, Moshe Cordovero, said the Jews of Northern Europe only had walnuts, apples, and pears to make the charoset with. And that would make the charoset that most of us are familiar with in North America, because most American Jews are descended from Ashkenazi backgrounds. Jewish legends tell how the blood of Jewish slaves was used in making the bricks in Egypt, and that may explain why wine is one of the ingredients in the charoset. But with the accusations of blood libel, that Jews were using the blood of Christian babies in their Passover foods, the recipe changed so that white wine and white vinegar were used instead of the red. Does anybody need more explanation of what blood libel was? Or terrible times sometimes. Okay. Your question arises with the charoset whether or not a blessing had to be said, because anytime a commandment is about to be fulfilled, you would normally say a blessing. Rambam thought we should say one for the charoset, but no Haggadahs have such a blessing, and there was no further rabbinical discussion on the topic. As I mentioned earlier, the custom was that all Seder foods before the meal were dipped before eating them. Numerous rabbis in the Middle Ages debated about whether bitter herbs should be dipped in water charoset. One concern was that the sweetness of the charoset would counteract the bitterness of the maror. And we have a rabbi in the Talmud warning against keeping the maror in the charoset for too long for that reason. A number of medieval Haggadahs mention the practice of dipping the charoset. Some say we are not obliged to dip. Others say you should dip. And that gives a picture of just how the practices were changing and how different regions had different practices. You know, whoever asked for the Haggadah to be written would then be specifying on which version they wanted on some major issues that rabbis were debating over. Any questions about the charosis? Okay, go on to the next here.
There's a question in the chat. Says, who was it that used black radish?
Rabbi Eliezer ben Judah of Worms. And as I said, that's in the handout. You've got it. The problem is, you know, trying to track down some of these ingredients. I'm fortunate that my local grocery store carries the stuff year round. Who knows why, but there's obviously some call for it. And it's worth it for them to make it available to all of us. So I can just find it over in the vegetable bins. But you know, when I first started doing this research, I was finding it only at right around Passover, because then people are looking for traditional foods and they're pulling out their old cookbooks and what their grandmothers made. And it was clearly something that people in Northern and Eastern Europe were doing. Any other questions?
Yep, I think we're good.
Okay. Bitter herbs called maror. The Mishnah lists several plants that meet the requirements for bitter herbs: lettuce, chicory, pepperwort, endive, and dandelion. Okay. Experts differ on the correct translations, but all agree that the first item is lettuce. So why bother continuing with the debate when lettuce is first on the list? So that's the preferred one. So as long as we all agree on lettuce, we'll let the translation issues go for the rest of them. But the lettuce of the time wasn't our familiar iceberg mild lettuce. One of the problems any SCA cook quickly runs into is that ingredients have changed. I did an event that was a Seder and really struggled to find enough bitter dandelion to use because all of the lettuces, you know, have been bred to be very mild. So I gave up on that. I was trying to use dandelion. And, you know, if I go out in my yard and look for the weeds, I find dandelion easily, and that's pretty bitter. But that won't do when I'm trying to feed 100 people. And so it can be a challenge. What all that list of possible plants have in common is that they have leaves. Horseradish wasn't used until after 1394 or so. And the problem that arose was related to availability. As Jews moved from milder climates to further east and north into Poland and Russia and areas where the snow was still on the ground when Passover came around, their ability to find anything with fragile green leaves it just wasn't there. They couldn't do it. And you can't require somebody to keep a law that's impossible to keep. So that's when the rabbis had to bend. Rashi, living in northern France, wrote about the difficulty of finding lettuce to use in maror one year. So it wasn't just the people in the Far East. There was much debate. Rabbeinu Tam, who was Rashi's grandson, in the 12th century ruled that bitter herb could not be a plant root and it had to have leaves. And he was so highly regarded that his opinion carried a lot of weight. By the first half of the 14th century, horseradish was an acceptable substitute, though, but lettuce was seen as preferable. Rabbi Israel ben Joel Suslin of Erfurt in the 14th century was the first we know of to allow horseradish under the circumstances of availability. Its use was taken for granted from this time on, even as rabbis continued to debate it. Rabbi Isaac Tirano in the 14th century Austria said if horseradish had to be used, then only the green shoots at its top should be eaten. And when I go looking for horseradish in the grocery store, they've been chopping the tops off because that's what spoils if you're putting it out for any length of time. So it's hard to convince the grocery store, don't chop it off, I want the green bits. And some plants only have a few shoots. I've tried eating them, and even though what I managed to find was half the size of a staple, it was quite bitter and very effective. But you need enough of those little green shoots for everybody at the table to have one. So one compromise was to use the top of the horseradish with its green shoots for the blessing, and then to use the root of it to grind up and make it for the Hillel sandwich. Opposition to horseradish continued until the 18th century. In Southern Europe, they continued to use lettuce, and the practice developed among German Jews to use pieces of horseradish, but in Eastern Europe, it was grated. Do people know what I mean when I say the Hillel sandwich?
I do not.
Okay, during the ceremony, there's a point where you eat matzah, charosis, and maror all together, okay?
Oh, okay.
And it's the ceremony states that that's how Hillel did it in temple times. So it's just sort of a joking reference to it because as being the Hillel sandwich, because obviously it wasn't, they didn't eat sandwiches. But since you're taking the matzah and piling stuff up on top of it, and often putting another piece of matzah on top, it looks like a sandwich.
Right.
And it just makes a quick way of referring to it.
Right. Oh, by the way, there was a question about if endive would do as a bitter herb.
Yes, the endive I found, yeah, it's number 4 on the list. The endive I found around here is really mild. So that's the problem, is that you're finding versions of things that just aren't bitter enough. Yeah, you can use lettuce, chicory, pepperwort, endive, and dandelion. And obviously lettuce there are many kinds of lettuce, but we breed for what's popular, and we like it mild. We don't want all those bitter flavors in our salads. Okay, back to the Hillel sandwich. Talk about that for a bit. The practice is described in the Mishnah of eating lamb charoset and maror together, not the matzah charoset and maror. Scholars debated about how these three foods were eaten in the time between the Mishnah and the our scholars between the time of the Mishnah and Talmud debated about how these three foods were eaten, and the debate is recorded in the Talmud. The questions that they were looking at was whether or not the matzah and bitter herbs and the charosis were all eaten all together or eaten separately. If done together, that you were then fulfilling three commandments at once, and then it's not possible to focus on each element properly. You want to be able to enjoy the experience of fulfilling a commandment. So doing three at once, it's sort of like it gets merged.
Katie, we have the 10-minute warning. I think that
No, this is a 2-hour class.
Is it a 2-hour?
Yeah.
Oh, okay, sorry.
Yeah.
No problem. Thank you, great.
Okay. The solution from the Babylonian Talmud was to do it twice. First, you eat the matzah and bitter herbs separately, and then you combine them into a sandwich. There are a number of Haggadahs we have from the Middle Ages. One, which is quite famous, is located in Washington, D.C. It's sort of fun. The Haggadahs are named often for where they're located. So you can see the one on the screen is called the Prague Haggadah. The one in Washington, D.C. at the Library of Congress is called the Washington Haggadah. One of my favorite is the Dropsy Haggadah, because that's the college that holds it. But the Washington Haggadah, which was completed in 1478, states that they use horseradish rather than lettuce, which previously had been the practice for bitter herbs in the Hillel sandwich. It's the early evidence of the transition to horseradish. There's a practice of reclining while you eat certain foods at the Seder, but reclining while eating the Hillel sandwich did not start until the 18th century. So if you're doing a medieval Seder, you're not reclining for that part. There was a custom in Italy and in Germany at the Seder for the man to point at his wife while holding the bitter herbs during this part of the ceremony. I was supposed to switch to the screen earlier, sorry. There's the Hillel sandwich being eaten. This is a Haggadah called the Bird's Head Haggadah because obviously everybody has birds' heads. It's sort of a fun one from the 1400s in France. Okay. So this practice of the man pointing at his wife while holding the bitter herbs is shown in several Haggadahs. It's supposed to be illustrating two verses from the Bible, one from Proverbs 5:4 and the other from Ecclesiastes 7:26. I've written them out here on the screen. Some Haggadahs show the woman recoiling from the bitter herbs her husband is showing, is shoving in her face. That's the one on the left. You sort of see that in the Washington Haggadah. Though I would warn that husband that his wife has a sword in her hand and he might want to be a little cautious about how far he pushes it. In other Haggadahs, you get the wife has a more feisty response. One of my favorite names of a Haggadah is the Hillock and Billock Haggadah, which dates from about 1465, and it has cartoon-like captions in it. There's one for this section, where the husband is saying, when saying this bitter herb, let me raise my voice. Indeed, both this lettuce and this wife are the cause of this bitterness. But the wife responds back, I thought you yourself were one of the causes of bitterness. So she's not just taking it, lying down, she's responding back. Okay, any questions about the bitter herbs, the maror, before we go on to the matzah? Okay. Some think leavening of bread was not common at the time of the Exodus when the Jews left Egypt where they'd been slaves. Some scholars think matzah is called the bread of affliction, not just because it's what the Jewish people made as they left Egypt, but it's because what they ate the whole time they were there. Matzah for Passover is made of 2 ingredients, water and flour. The flour can be made of wheat, oats, barley, spelt, or rye, but it has no leavening in it. By now you know that the rabbis are going to debate about how long it should take, in this case, to make the matzah and to make sure that no leavening action happens. The Mishnah says it's begun to rise when it swelled, had streaks or cracks, or turned white. The Talmud specified that only a brief time could elapse after the water was added to the flour until it was removed from the oven. And that time they specified as the length of time to walk a Roman mile. And it goes further to describe it's how long it takes to walk from the fish tower to Tiberias. And that would be like giving landmarks in Cambridge or Oxford or, Ann Arbor to say, enough people go here, people are familiar with this place. There was a rabbinical school in Tiberias, so they would have known how far the fish tower was from that. But it was a reasonable way to define it. When I first started doing experiments on making matzah, I made the mistake of starting with the thing all of us know, matzah has to be made in 18 minutes, and I was trying to figure out how to do that. And I did come up with a way to do it, and I did make it. It took me lots of failures. But I at an A&S presentation, display I did of it, somebody asked me a really good question. How did they know when 18 minutes was up? And I had to admit I didn't know, and I spent a year looking for the answers. Medieval timekeeping was not that exact. Minute hands weren't on clocks until the 18th century. Clocks weren't that reliable. If you go through Jewish manuscripts, illuminated manuscripts from the time, there are no signs of water clocks or hourglasses in the kitchens. There's a fascinating book with a really boring title called Jewish Life in the Middle Ages, written by a husband and wife, Metzger and Metzger. And, they look at all the Jewish manuscripts we have with pictures and break it down to, these are all the pictures of bedrooms, these are all the pictures of fountains, these are all the pictures of kitchens, these are the pictures of dining, people dining. And so they're they're talking about what normal life looked like based on the illuminations. And I pored over that book great detail looking for any sign of anything that could be looked at as some sort of timekeeper, and couldn't find anything. As I said, the mistake I made early on was to tie the timekeeping to the value of chai, 18. That actually didn't come into being a practice until the 18th century. Do all of you know what Gematria is? Yes, no? Okay, Gematria is the practice of assigning numbers to letters. So A is 1, B is 2, C is 3, and then adding up the value of a word. So if you take the word for life, chai, and you add up those letters, you get to 18. And the modern practice of cooking matzah for 18 minutes is tied to that. The thought is that after 18 minutes, you have life, you have leaven. But the first use of chai is 18 can be traced back to Rabbi Nahum of Chernobyl, who lived from 1730 to 1797. He was a disciple of the Baal Shem Tov, the founder of the Hasidic movement. It was originally used as the amount of money to give in charity, because if you give 18 rubles, you have given life to someone. It wasn't expanded to other uses for a while after that, though it's not clear exactly when. The rabbis had different opinions, of course, about how long you could work the matzah until it had to be considered as leaven. Rashi said that the time alone should not be an indication of leavening, and that it should be taken into account only if there was a doubt. Rambam wrote that as long as the dough was actively being kneaded, even for an entire day, the dough did not become leavened until it was left alone the time it takes to walk that Roman mile. And by his calculation, that would be 2/5 of an ordinary hour of 60 minutes, or work out to be 24 minutes. He seems to be the first major rabbinical authority to rule that time is a factor in determining whether matzah dough is kosher. Rabbi Isaac ben Moses of Vienna, who died in 1260, disagreed, saying that dough becomes leavened after the time it takes to go 4 Roman miles, which is, by his calculation, 72 minutes, regardless of how much it's needed. But Rabbi Asher ben Jehiel of the 13th century thought that if dough was left alone for only a very short time, it immediately became leavened. So there's a lot of disagreement here, but clearly everybody thinks you get longer than the modern practice of 18 minutes.
Some of the regular cookbooks have it's explicit right in the book. You do it for 5 Hail Marys or whatever, or a particular song. So I'm wondering if music wasn't a way to keep time for.
I looked at that, and the problem is that Jews wouldn't use prayers as they would think that was taking God's name in vain.
No, but I just meant like maybe they had some songs, because I know there's a lot of like secular songs too.
Right. I couldn't find any sign of that. That was one of the things I was looking for.
Mm-hmm.
I am aware that that's a Christian practice, but I couldn't find it being used in Jewish circles. And clearly, here you have these major rabbis going, well, you get 72 minutes, well, that's a long time. You know, Rambam saying you can keep kneading it all day as long as you keep kneading it. So I came to the conclusion they were really just looking for signs of leavening, not for a specific time to pass. At the end of the Middle Ages, when the Shulchan Aruch, late 1500s, it actually comes out quite I'll read this section and then you'll understand why I'm saying it's sort of hard to figure out where it comes down on it. The dough should not be left idle for even a moment. As long as it's being used, even the whole day, it will not rise. If it is left idle for the time it takes to walk a Roman mile, it is leaven. Okay, so they're clearly giving a lot more flexibility. I also came across an interesting quote from Rabbi Schnauert Zalman of Liadi, who died in 1812. Okay, and he wrote of a recent custom in his day of shortening the time for making matzah, and said that the practice had changed about 20 years earlier. And he speaks about a problem of, because the dough couldn't be worked as much, you were more likely to end up with pockets of unincorporated flour mixed into the dough. And so he was making rules based on that. But as I said, he died in the early 1800s. So for us in the Middle Ages, where they're kneading the heck out of this dough, that's not an issue. The appearance of the matzah was different. In the 4th century, it became the practice to decorate and mark the matzah. Rabbis were concerned that bakers and housewives would let the dough rise in their attempts to beautify it. So it became the practice to use a mold that the matzah dough could be pressed into, leaving a design. And you can see here, there's a design there in the matzah. And the ones that I've been making have been somewhat smaller, but I press them into a shortcake mold and get a design of flowers and leaves on it that way, as well as the scoring marks that would have been in the medieval matzah. Rambam allowed the reverse of the other rabbis. He said the bakers could decorate it, but not the housewives, because he was afraid not all of them would have a mold. The final decision was not to allow molds, because in case the dough got stuck in it and couldn't be cleaned well, and the dough left clinging to the mold could then become leavened. But that wasn't until the 1700s. It was perforated to keep it
there's a question there's a question in the chat about how did you get the 1-inch thick versus modern?
There are descriptions of it that say as fat as a finger. And I've gone poking at it. I can find one description and everybody quotes it. And it comes out of England, and there is a Sephardic tradition of fatter matzah. And in doing all my experiments, I had a terrible time getting the matzah to cook all the way through. And if you don't get it thoroughly cooked, it turns into a hockey puck in about 7 or 8 hours. which might explain matzah bride, but when a family would be making matzah enough for a whole week. And I just couldn't believe that the stuff I was making would qualify. Usually doing food experiments, if it's not working, it's me that's the problem, not the medieval cook. They knew what they were doing. I'm trying to figure it out. And for a recipe that's as simple as flour and water, by experimenting, you figure out how to make a thick disc out of it, what the proportions are. If you don't make it, if you put in too much flour, you can't get it all absorbed. If you put in too much water, it's too doughy. So you quickly figure out the right proportions. But that part seemed easy. What temperature, how to make it come out right, took me many, many failures. The trick turned out to be the temperature, 600 degrees. But I'll get to that in a minute. One of the things with the matzah was it was pricked all over. You can see the bird's head Haggadah there. They're using a sort of fork to prick it with. They used various tools. They were also put perpendicular slashes in it to form an X, sort of like Irish soda bread, which makes the matzah easier to break. The designs were used sometimes to differentiate the three that got put on the matzah, on the Seder plate. They could be marked with lines like Roman numerals or Hebrew letters, Aleph, Bet, Gimel. They were given names, the three that were set aside, the priest, the Levite, the Israelite sometimes. Interestingly, the Jews in Southern Europe didn't put any distinguishing marks on those three matzahs to be set aside. Yeah, this is where I've got to the part of describing what it took to do the cooking of it. Here you can see it's a sort of a group effort, lots of people working on it. I forgot to show this earlier. When I was doing these experiments and talking to people about all my failures, one of my friends came up with this cartoon. How to tell whether or not it's time to take out the matzah. Obviously, nobody had cell phones back then. But it just tells you how frustrated I was getting with all my failures. Thin matzah began to replace the thicker variety at the beginning of the 16th century. So they got smart and said, nah, let's see if we can figure this out, a better solution. But in the process of me doing all these experiments, I ordered some Sephardic Matzah made in Brooklyn, and then FedEx to me. The shipping was the biggest deal. It was only coming to New Jersey and it had to be FedEx, so I'd get it fast enough. And this was fatter Sephardic matzah. They did it with whole wheat flour instead of white flour. But I have to say, when I broke it open and saw a doughy middle, I was delighted. They had an unbroken tradition. They should have been able to pass on the skill from one generation to another of how to cook it through thoroughly. And somehow they weren't managing to do it. What I found was that at 600 degrees, which is higher than most American ovens get to, you can get it to cook thoroughly. I ended up going to a colonial baking contest that was being held close to me. And since nobody showed up to participate in the contest, I was the only person there for an hour picking the brains of these colonial bakers. And one of them has written a number of cookbooks on how to do colonial cooking. Now, I live in an area where, George Washington really did sleep here. So there's lots of people doing Revolutionary War reenactment stuff. And what she told me about was how they made biscuits in the fire. They would cook them in one portion of the coals and then flip them over into a different portion of the coals because the coals got too cold as they cooked initially. And so if you look at the recipe that I've put in the handout as a cheater's way to make the thing work, you use a really large Dutch oven because you're trying to concentrate the heat down to be smaller than a big American oven. So you preheat that ahead of time. You put the matzah in one side, cook it for half the time, flip it over and cook it for the other half of the time. And it gets cooked thoroughly. You don't have it a doughy patch in the middle, and it does work. I've also managed to use pizza ovens that get high enough, and wood burning stove ovens that get high enough, and do it at 600 degrees. But I did all kinds of crazy experiments trying to figure out how to make this work. With such a simple recipe, as I said, you would have thought the medieval rabbis would just agree on what the proper recipe was, but they didn't. It's unclear from the writings whether or not it was hard or whether it was floppy like pita. The debate continued on, we know in one region in Europe, they added salt to the water used to make matzah, but there was a concern that it might make the matzah puff up and look like it had risen from the yeast. So it was decided that that was not an acceptable variation to the recipe. Rashi's son-in-law, Rashbam, disagreed with other Ashkenazi rabbis about the proper amount of flour to use. And it turned out to be a really uncivil discourse with people insulting each other back and forth over it. And unfortunately, the details to this disagreement have been lost. I don't know how you could argue. I mean, I make bread all the time. I need stuff regularly. I don't know how you could have much variation because you're trying to get a dough that's hard enough that it will keep the slash marks you put in it. If you're putting it into a mold, that will keep the pattern that the mold has. It seems like there's the demands of the dough tell you what the proportion should be. All matzah was round until the early 1900s when machinery began to be used to make it. Square matzah wasted less and fit into the new machinery better. And of course, when that was introduced, there were lengthy debates over whether or not this was kosher matzah and concerns about the ability to clean the machinery well. Matzah was supposed to be cooked the afternoon before Passover. The rabbis were adamant that it could not be cooked any earlier. They preferred it to be done after 1:30 in the afternoon. German rabbis in the 11th and 12th century were the strictest about this. There was a late 16th century custom for husbands and wives to work as a team to bake it. It sounds to me like a recipe for family discord, because everybody's trying to get ready for the Seder and finish up all what needs to happen for Passover. But the idea is that the wife would mix the dough together and the husband would say the blessings. And that's based on the Talmud giving descriptions of how to make matzah. You were not supposed to eat it before the Seder. In fact, you shouldn't eat anything at all after about 3 in the afternoon, so you'll have a good appetite and you'll be hungry for the matzah. Any questions about it so far? I want to go to Shmura matzah.
No questions in the chat, so clear.
Okay. Shmura matzah means guarded matzah. If you go to the grocery store before Passover now, you'll find the standard boxes of matzah that aren't that expensive. And then the really expensive big boxes like this of what are guarded matzah. And they can be $20 for 3 matzah in there. I mean, it is expensive stuff. And that's because it's been protected and carefully watched over to make sure the flour didn't come into contact with water before it was made into the matzah. The practice today is to use it for at least the Seder. We have some early writings from the time between the Mishnah and the Talmud, which says to guard the matzah so it won't be disqualified. But it seems to be referring to being careful about the actual mixing of the dough. The Talmud has a long discussion about washing the grain, but it doesn't say that the grain should be watched over from the time it's harvested, which is what they do today. The Gaonim, the heads of the Babylonian academies, said flour needed to be guarded from the time it was kneaded. Early Ashkenazic and French custom was to guard the flour once it was ground, but that may have been related to the fact that their mills were powered by water and the chance of the flour getting damp was higher. The modern milling practice is to dampen the grain before grinding it using high-speed mills. And they dampen it to make sure it doesn't combust, because flour is very flammable. But because we dampen it before it's milled, there's a possibility for the flour to become leavened. And grain intended to be used for matzah is dry milled, so it can be used for Passover. Rabbi Caro in the Shulchan Aruch combined a number of practices. He said that it was best to use Seder matzah that had been guarded from the time it was harvested, but it should at least be guarded from when it was ground. But if necessary, the flour could be purchased in the market and then guarded from the time that the dough was mixed. I mean, there are even descriptions of somebody coming back with their really treasured special flour and being inspired to give it to a beggar because they need the food, and turning around and buying just standard flour from the market. And that is praised as a good choice that person made to give away their special flour. Water was also guarded. It wasn't just the flour. In medieval towns, there were wells that only the Jews used, and they guarded them from before Passover to make sure that the water stayed pure. The Shulchan Aruch, it says to let the water stand overnight to cool before using it. And that specifies that the water should be drawn by a Jew. Some details about the matzah were related to weekly Sabbath practices. The Sabbath practice is to have 2 loaves of bread on Friday night, because it's like the double portion of manna in the wilderness provided on Friday, so the Jews didn't have to work to collect it on Sabbath. No mention in the Talmud is made of extending this rule to other holidays. And it's not mentioned until like 9th century that it became the practice to use 2 loaves for festivals. But it also raises the question of how many matzahs to use. The Babylonian and Palestinian practice was 1 whole and 1 broken matzah. The broken matzah was considered to be like the bread of poverty, since the poor couldn't afford whole loaves. The Babylonian custom varied on the Sabbath. They'd use 2 whole and 1 broken, but that caused confusion, because having 1.5 matzahs if the Seder was on an ordinary day and 2.5 matzahs if the Seder was held on the Sabbath, it was a short-lived practice. In the period after the Gaonim, after 1040, the leading rabbis ruled that 2.5 matzahs should always be used. The Talmud says to place the broken piece between 2 whole matzahs, and in order to have a whole matzah above and below the broken one, the custom changed to having 3 matzahs and then breaking 1 of them. The rabbis differed on how many matzahs to use for quite a while. Rambam, Rabbi Eliezer ben Joel Halevi, Rabbi Eliezer ben Natan of Mainz in the 12th and 13th century only required 2 pieces of matzah. Some thought it was inappropriate to serve broken matzah. Rabbi Isaac ben Moses of Vienna in the 13th century mentions the practice of 3 matzah. And finally, the Shulchan Aruch says, hey, 3 matzahs, and that's how we do it today. Matzah's eaten 4 times during the Seder. First it's eaten plain, then it's eaten with maror, then it's eaten as the Hillel sandwich, and finally at the very end of the meal in something called the afikomen. There were rabbinical debates over which of those 4 times is the one that fulfills the commandment to eat matzah. And related to that was the question of what was the smallest amount you could eat and still have it count. And the decision was the size of the amount should be the size of an olive. But we now debate over what that means, because olives can be different sizes and some rabbis have never seen an olive. And my favorite one was, what do you do with the matzah that gets caught in your teeth and in your gums? Does that count? The answer was, if it's in your teeth, it doesn't count. And if it's in your gums, it does. Afikomen is an unusual term. It's used to describe the final piece of matzah that's eaten at the end of the Seder meal. The Machzor Vitri, which was written by a disciple of Rashi's, says that the broken matzah that's going to be used as the afikomen should be placed under the tablecloth, perhaps to make sure that it didn't get eaten by mistake while everybody was eating the meal.
Can you move the slide down? You're number 9, and I think you want to show number 10.
I went the one for afikomen. Yep. Yep, there you go. Great, thanks. Yeah, this is from the Bird's Head Haggadah, and you can see somebody retrieving it from under the tablecloth where they've hidden it away. Make sure nobody eats it. Other writings specify that the broken piece of matzah should be wrapped in a cloth and put aside. Modern practice is to turn it into a treasure hunt, and kids make out like bandits, but it's hard to figure out when that actually happened. It may have developed from Rambam's interpretation of a phrase from the Babylonian Talmud about how to keep children awake during the Seder. And he says you should snatch the matzah from them. Children stealing the matzah can be documented in the 1600s. I mean, nowadays it's held for ransom and the whole Seder stops until negotiations can be done to get the matzah back that the children have stolen. Rabbi Iserles in the Shulchan Aruch allows the afikomen to be replaced by another piece if the hidden one can't be found. So you can bet that was happening. And I've heard from other people in teaching this class that they've had that happen in their houses and didn't know what to do. Well, here's the ruling. Rabbis instructed the Seder shouldn't take so long that children fall asleep before eating the afikomen, even though it says the more one tells of the departure from Egypt, the more he is to be praised. It was decided that that applied to discussions after the meal when the kids could be sent off to bed after they'd eaten the afikomen, which had to be consumed before midnight. 2 blessings are said for matzah because there are 2 instructions in the Bible. One is to eat the matzah as food, and the other is to eat it at the Seder. Any questions about all this? Okay.
Nope, clear.
Okay. Wine. These are crazy wine cups that they're using. Okay, the Mishnah specifies that 4 cups of wine be used, but it's unclear whether 5 are required. So it evolved into having 4 cups at the Seder and setting aside 1 for Elijah. And this is one of those questions that when Elijah comes, he'll resolve a bunch of legal questions like this one. An old tradition discourages women from drinking, but the Babylonian Talmud says that women and children are obligated to drink the 4 cups of wine because they were affected by the same miracle. Strong wine was served, and it was expected that it would be cut with water. Drinking uncut wine was thought to be boorish. It's usually 2 parts water to 1 part wine to bring down the alcohol level to 4 or 5%. In the time of the Talmud, uncut wine was considered unfit for consumption. Talmud, in fact, says that wine for the Seder should be 3 parts water to 1 part wine. So that means if you had 4 cups of wine, it'd be the equivalent of 1 cup. Rashi said the wine should be mixed in the cup and not prepared ahead of time, and this became the practice. There were several decisions by the heads of those Babylonian academies, the Gaonim, and they had several traditions. One was that they specified that the cup be the size of 1.5 eggs. They decided that a blessing should be said over each of the 4 cups because each cup had its own separate commandment. And the one I liked is that Saadia Gaon, who died in about 975, added a question before the first blessing over the wine. The question is it agreeable, gentlemen? Meaning, is the wine drinkable? And the answer was l'chaim. Rabbi, somebody wanted to say something?
Yeah, there was a question about, does the wine have to be kosher?
Oh, always.
Always, it's okay.
Rabbi Eliezer ben Joel Halevi in the 13th century and some early German authorities taught that the cup should be washed and dried after each use, which seems sort of awkward to do, and debates about how to fill the cup. Some wanted it to overflow, but then you'd have to rewash your hands every time, and it was decided against doing that. You may have been told at the Seder that whatever you pour in your cup, you have to drink, which ends up with people drinking too much. That's not what the medieval rabbis taught. They said, if you pour a full cup, meaning it to be the total amount you drink, then you can split it between all 4 cups, and that's all right. So if you have too much in if you pour it and you find you have too much in there, you have a way around it without getting drunk. The blessing over the wine was expanded to be much longer in the Middle Ages. It described how good wine was for comforting the bereaved, healing the sick, and causing people to rejoice. Saadia Gaon mentions that this prayer was being used, and he thought the practice was incorrect. He was supported by the other Gaonim, and his opinion prevailed. The Seder custom of dropping a wine, the Seder custom is to spill a drop of wine as each plague is recited during the ceremony. Rabbi Eliezer of Worms in the 13th century was the first to mention this custom, but he said it had been instituted 200 years earlier with Rabbi Eliezer Haggadahs. He described how the custom was to dip the index finger to sprinkle 16 drops of wine outside the cup. Why sweet wine? Well, Jews in Southern and Western Europe preferred dry wines, but the Jews in Eastern Europe lived in areas where grapes did not grow well. Wine made from the substandard grapes they could occasionally get required the addition of a lot of sugar to be drinkable. The solution was to make wine from raisins, which are easy to transport, and it results in a sweet wine similar to sherry. I did a lot of experiments with this. I found that it ferments within about 5 to 7 days, and as it ages, as I said, tastes a lot like sherry. It becomes very pleasant to drink within a month, but it could certainly be drunk earlier. Sweet, syrupy Concord grape wine is not required for a kosher Passover Seder, but it may be the custom of some families, and tradition is important. My brother-in-law loves the stuff. We tell him, bring it for yourself. You're taking the bottle back with you. But Concord grapes weren't developed until 1849. So it's certainly not medieval. Any questions about it? You've got the recipe for the raisin wine in the handout.
Question. I asked, other wines used besides Concord grape?
Oh yeah, there are lots of kosher wines.
Okay, then the next question is, what makes a wine kosher?
First place, it's made by Jews. And that is one of the specifications. Yeah, there's some practices of how they purify the wine that would be less kosher to us. But it isn't, I mean, if you think of it just being oh, the basics of, you bottle the wine and let it do its thing. But before you bottle it, there are things they do to purify it. And that's where the issues come in.
Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, on to the main meal. Oh, I could just say one thing about making the raisin wine is that when I did it for our Kingdom A&S contest, I got lumped, instead of being in the food category, I got suddenly lumped with the brewers, who I usually don't. I'm not a big drinker, so I don't like beer a lot, so I'm not in with that group often. And here were all these people doing these really fancy things to make their wines, and all these extra steps and all this equipment. And I'm just going, well, I'm just a Jewish housewife making it for my own family. And this was really simple, and this is what I did. And I realized I was doing the medieval method of making wine. They were buying very expensive grape juice that was coming from France, that was coming from vineyards, and I was going to Trader Joe's and getting a pound of raisins. So if I ended up with a thing not working, I'd lost less than $5, because the ingredients were a bag of raisins and either wine or organic sugar. And it wasn't a big deal if it didn't work. If they didn't do all the stuff to protect their the way that they were making the wine, they were going to lose hundreds of dollars. So I could take the risks of using really old methods that everybody kept telling me, no, you can't do this. It never works. And I'm going, well, I'm getting something. And if it doesn't work, the first batch I made came out perfectly. The next 5 I made all got moldy for some reason. But I had that first batch, which really worked. And so I knew that I was doing something wrong. And it turned out that I needed to sterilize better. But the fact that what I was doing had such simple ingredients and such simple methods sort of they didn't quite know what to make of it, because how do you judge this? It was sort of funny at that point. I never expect to win those competitions, so that was a good thing. Okay, on to the main meal. In temple times, the meat served at a Seder was the lamb that was sacrificed at the temple. But with the destruction of that temple in 70 CE, the practice ended. The concern of medieval rabbis was that if lamb was served slaughtered like other meats, some people might think it had been sacrificed. So their solution was to avoid serving lamb, but that didn't happen fast. Some scholars think the practice of eating lamb began to die out in the 7th century, but you find roast lamb still being served in the 10th and 11th century. And here you can see a picture from the Prague Haggadah dated 1526, which clearly shows what looks like a lamb on that platter. So I don't think that's an accurate picture of what they were serving, but it certainly was something that they were talking about having. And goat is included in this ruling about lamb. The question is what to serve instead. They serve two types of roasted meat to make the meal different from a normal night. The Talmud says you could have bone and broth. You could have two cooked dishes. One was to remind them of the Passover lamb, and the other was to remind people of the sacrifice, the burnt offering brought to the temple on festivals. Rabbi Shira Gaon in the 10th century said that the two dishes were in memory of Moses and Aaron, and some had the custom of adding a third dish in memory of Miriam. And I find this interesting. Here you've got the 10th century, they're adding something to remember Miriam, and it's a modern practice that people are adding something to the table to remember Miriam that has started in my memory. But here you've got the practice going all the way back into the Middle Ages, if you want to revive something. One practice was to bring two roasted dishes to the table, but not to eat them. Rabbis Caro and Iserles in the Shulchan Aruch said the solution was to use a shank bone and an egg in place of the lamb carcass, and that's what we do today. Another option of something to eat at the Seder meal was chicken. By the 15th century, they were an important food animal in Central and Eastern European Jewish homes. But a lot of German Jews during the Middle Ages refrained from eating chicken or any kind of poultry during the first days of Passover because they feared there would be grain in the chicken's digestive tract. There were also problems with guilds and governments over, especially in France, over kosher slaughtering. They weren't allowing Jews to slaughter beef unless they had a government official there. And what he was there to do was to stab the heart of the animal just as its throat had been cut, thus preventing the animal from being kosher because it needs to pump out all that blood really fast. So here you have quickly a problem. What does a Jewish housewife serve if she can't do lamb, she can't do goat, she can't do beef, she can't do poultry? What is she going to use for those two meals, which are supposed to be a feast? Well, she's left with cheese, eggs, and fish. Another logistical issue is that the early seders, the seder, there wasn't a seder plate. It was a small table. And on that table was everything you were going to use for this seder meal, including the food. So you were eating everything that was there. And so I can't imagine any Jewish housewife watching her stew coagulate and become inedible as people ask questions and do the whole ceremony. It's even sped up, it's at least 45 minutes from the time you start until you get to the meal. And I can imagine that housewife kicking her husband under the table going, come on, speed it up, don't ask any more questions, let's keep going. That's not going to fly for very long. So my hunch is that she's more likely to have served meals that could be served at room temperature or cold and made ahead of time to make life a little simpler on the last day of preparing for Passover. But that's just making educated guesses based on human nature. The Romans had a practice of starting a meal with eggs, and roasted eggs were very popular. And using eggs at the Seder became fixed in the Middle Ages. Eating eggs dipped in salt water dates from at least the 700s at Seders. The egg on the Seder plate was consumed. As I said, everything on that Seder plate, the ceremonial foods were eaten. In the early Middle Ages, the Seder plate was actually, as I said, it was actually a table. Okay. So it's hard to pinpoint when a roasted egg was added to the Seder plate. Roasting eggs in embers is a common way to prepare eggs in the Middle Ages, but the technique has been lost. You basically, if you've been cooking all day and over a hearth, and you have, at the end of the day, you bank the fire. What you would do is draw take a poker or stick and draw a trench in the hot coals and the hot ashes, and bury room temperature eggs in it and cover it over with the ashes. And in the morning, it's cooked. So it's about as simple a cooking method as you can get, but because we're not cooking with hearths anymore, it's not a way we usually do it. It ends up with the egg, when you crack it, it looks normal until you crack the shell and you discover that what you think ought to be a white section of the egg has turned the color of tea, and the yolk has turned creamy, and all of it tastes sort of salty, sort of smoky, because the shells are permeable, and the wood ash has affected the flavor of the egg. If you search on the internet for Orthodox women roasting eggs, what you find is them taking hard-boiled eggs and adding scorch marks, or baking them, but they're not using the method making them with wood ash. I've given you a recipe for how to do it. You can do it in a fireplace if you have one, but if you don't have one, you get your hands on a pot worth of ashes. I had to go, since I was living in a house that didn't have a fireplace at that time, I had to go to a bunch of places to find wood ash. And basically I took my corn on the cob pot and filled it with ashes. I preheat that in the oven and then bury the eggs in it. I can do about 5 or 6 at a time and leave it in the oven overnight. And so you can do it, the traditional way, if you have a fireplace, or the non-traditional way that works and if you don't have one. Are there any questions about that?
Yeah, we're heading up to 10 minutes.
Right, I'm almost done.
Okay, no problem. Just wanted, I didn't know if you saw the word.
I just scrapped a section about roofs in order to start in on beans. Okay. It became the practice not to eat legumes during the Passover during the Middle Ages. It's a class of food that's called kitnio, which generally speaking, they're made of small seeds of plants that might be ground into flour. It might be mistaken for being standard flour. And in the Middle Ages, this became a new distinction, a difference between the cooking of the Sephardic and the Ashkenazic Jews during Passover. The Sephardic Jews allow legumes and the Ashkenazi do not. The ban on them is first mentioned by Rabbi Asher ben Saul of Lunel in southern France and Provence in the 13th century. He said it was the custom because legumes were subject to fermentation, which is questionable, but that's what he's saying. And in fact, another Provençal authority, Rabbi Manoah of Narbonne, at the time rejected that thinking. The problem was that lentils and legumes were associated with pagan customs in Provence, and the rabbis may have wanted to distance themselves from practices associated with it. Also, advances in agriculture, such as crop rotation, was being used, and a field planted with wheat one year might be planted with beans the next, and stray wheat plants would grow up among the beans. Rabbi Eliezer ben Judah of Worms prohibited legumes, and he said, "We do not eat beans and lentils because there is wheat in them." The Ashkenazi followed the opinion of Rabbi Moshe ben, I don't know how you pronounce it, Couchy, in the 13th century France, who stated that kitniot products can look like hametz, the flour forbidden during Passover, and to prevent confusion, all kitniot were banned. Interestingly, there were many medieval rabbis and leading authorities who refused to accept the validity of the prohibition of beans because they couldn't find a legal basis for it in Jewish law. Rambam thought they were fine. But it has been a tradition since then. Interestingly, in 2015, so 6 years ago, conservative rabbis ruled that kitniot doesn't have to be avoided during Passover, but for many, the tradition is still strong.
There's a question. There's actually a question in the chat about how did rice get in the kitniot then?
Yeah, I tried hard when I was doing the hunt for what to make for a main meal. I started by looking at the Talmud that said, you know, have rice and spinach is one of the options that is listed in the Talmud. And I could not find that rice was being eaten in Ashkenazi regions. You could find it in southern France, but nowhere else. And it would seem like rice it's transportable, it's dried, it's, you know, it obviously doesn't rise. Why aren't they eating it? And they aren't. I don't have a reason why. It's just doesn't seem to have been part of their diet and wasn't something they'd even consider during Passover. Not much is written on the topic of desserts or sweet things for Passover. Partly it wasn't a practice to write much about what you ate. It's considered to be rude. But the Mishnah says that the Seder doesn't end with dainties. In Talmudic times, it describes eating mushrooms and pigeons and dates and nuts at the end of the meal. Obviously, the afikomen is eaten last. Jews generally ate kosher versions of whatever the surrounding community ate. And there aren't any medieval cookbooks. So we're left looking at the cookbooks of everybody else and trying to figure out kosher versions for it. Anything we want to make. Cakes made with beaten egg whites to leaven them began to be made in Spain around the year 1000. They discovered that whipping egg white with sugar trapped the bubbles, but it's hard to make because the egg whites were whipped with a branch with twigs. I mean, this is where you really want servants. And the Italians began making these cakes in the mid 1400s, but they didn't catch on in the Ashkenazi regions until the 1600s. My guess is that a smart housewife would preserve some fruit during the year and save it to eat at the Seder. So I've given two recipes. One is for sort of a jam, because they would have just eaten that with a spoon. It wasn't served over or anything. And the other is for a compote, which you could make using dried fruit. But what we think of as desserts served at the end of the meal, we weren't doing. If you're interested in putting on a medieval Seder, there's some medieval Haggadahs that have been translated into English. There's the Washington Haggadah you can get your hands on, the Ashkenazi Haggadah, the Bird's Head Haggadah, and I found a partial translation of the Prague Haggadah at the Library of Congress. And I'm trying to find a source for that, but I've given you the sources for the other ones. One weird thing about as you start reading these medieval Haggadahs is that the modern ones will say, you know, add this, they'll put in something in parenthesis and say these extra words if it's the Sabbath, or say this if it's the end of the Sabbath. They don't do it that way. They give you the whole, 3 pages worth of prayers for if it's a normal day, if it's the Sabbath, if it's the Havdalah, the end of the Sabbath. So you get the same thing repeating 3 times with the 3 variations, and then you move on to the rest of the Seder. There is a proverb from the Middle Ages. You can find in England, Spain, and Italy. A Jew will spend his all on Passover, a Turk on his nuptials, and a Christian on his quarrels and lawsuits. And with that, I'll end. Any other questions?
Yeah, I don't see any other questions. Just FYI, I was checking for the handout. Katie, I messaged you also in Facebook. If you can re-email those out to me, sure. I could save it because I don't see the attachment anywhere. So
yeah, I tried to make it easy on everybody.
Yeah, no problem. When you were, I know this might be a stupid question, but when you're talking about cakes, it's not, it wouldn't be the equivalent, because you were saying as early as 11th century, I guess, that they were trying to. It's not, I've been trying to document also cake. So just generally speaking, but it wouldn't have been like that sweet of a sweet, right? It would be more like a very dense kind of.
I ended up doing all these jam experiments and custard experiments. I was doing things that you could have done several days in advance or months in advance that would work. Just I was trying to think about that poor Jewish housewife and how can she make life a little more livable. And so that was my solution. I didn't go hunting for cakes. So I'd have to go, to give you a real answer, I'd have to go do the research.
Yeah, no problem. I'm still looking around, so it's okay.
No, as I said,
Awesome.
I usually end up with doing things where it takes me a year to do the research behind something. The matzah actually took me 3 years. I did the initial matzah and came up with it. That was 1 year. Then the next year was, how do we do the timing of this? And the third one was related to all the research I did on afikomen and the timing of the meal and things like that. So
right.
Yeah, I did 2 years on desserts, but so I did one on custards and one on jams. To work. But
Wow. Maybe I'm very interested in desserts, especially things that could be shared at an SCA event. It seems there was another conversation that I missed, which was, making it more accessible for, people, regular people in the SCA, that, medieval food is not yucky. So I kind of feel like sugar, sweets are like the
yeah, but in
easiest
custards,
thing.
you could make, for a feast cook, you could make that a week ahead of time in just little cup thingies. And
Little
then
cups, yeah.
put some jam on the table at the same time, and the two go together really nicely. The custards weren't that sweet, but the jam really peps them up.
Yeah, I'm sure. Okay, cool. Does anybody else have any other questions? Just like I've been typing in the chat, we will be sharing the handouts into the West Coast Culinary Symposium Facebook group, not the event, because the event kind of goes away. And the West will be hosting on their YouTube channel the videos. So
Great.
oh yeah, Kay, if you wouldn't mind sharing the rest of the slides, because I think there we see a couple more.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Here's a roasted egg from the Tacum Sanitatis. That's the last one.
Oh, okay.
But it shows somebody, cooking an egg over fire. That there was one technique was to cook them very briefly on a fire, and that may be what he's doing, but it may also be that he's getting ready to roast them.
Okay, great. I'm going to stop the recording. Thank you so much for sharing all this information. This is a great presentation.
It's a lot to take in at once.
It's a lot.
And there isn't an easy way to split it.
Right. And thank you very much again.
Okay.